Welcome back to the channel, guys. Thanks for joining me. In today's episode we're going to be changing the front springs on an Audi A6 C7 chassis with a 3-litre TDI engine. Now the reason for this is because when the car was sitting outside my house, the front springs actually collapsed under their own weight of the vehicle, which is quite suspicious really. Not sure why that happened. I mean, I actually caught it on my CCTV on the house as well. I'll play the clip now to show you what happened. As you can see there, there's nobody near the vehicle. They literally just collapsed, and that happened on both sides on 2 separate days, and they seem to have broke on the same point as well at the bottom of the spring. But anyway, I've got the new springs here. I've actually gone for the Sachs springs. I mean, there's not much to it really, it's literally just a spring. But anyway, there you go. That's all it is really. So yeah, we're going to head outside now and get the old shock absorber off the vehicle, bring the shock absorber into the workshop, obviously fit the new spring, and then we'll fit the whole lot back on. Okay, once you've jacked the vehicle up and you remove the wheel, first thing you're going to want to do, put an axle stand under the arm under here just to secure it so it don't fall on you when you're working on the vehicle. Once you've done that, you're going to want to move on under the engine bay here. You've got this strip all the way along here. This just pulls off. Pull it off all the way along. And then this plastic that goes all the way along the back there, you lift it up and you pull it towards you, just like that. Once you've removed the plastic trim, what you're going to do next is you move around the back here. You're going to want to remove that nut and bolt. Now before you do so, I would suggest cleaning the thread up where you're going to be taking the bolt off with a wire brush and some WD-40. The next step is you're going to need an 18mm spanner to fit onto the nut just there, and an 18mm ratchet on the other side, because obviously you're going to be loosening the nut side with the spanner first. Let's see if we can crack that off. Now these nuts and these bolts are going to be extremely tight because they've most likely been on there since the vehicle was made. It will come eventually though, like this one is now. Now once you've got it loosened off enough, you then put the spanner onto the other side and use the ratchet to slacken the rest of it off much quicker. Once you've removed this nut, leave the bolt in position just for the time being. You're going to want to move on to removing the bolt that holds the anti-roll bar onto this section, as I'll show you in a second. So just here, where the anti-roll bar connects up to this lower arm bit we were just undone, is a 16mm bolt in the back end of it just here. I'm going to need to remove that. Now when the bolt's almost loose, there shouldn't be too much tension on the anti-roll bar on here because you actually jacked the vehicle into the air already and the suspension's already fully extended. I actually wasn't recording just then as that went, but as you can see, it has dropped down just a little bit. It's not too much, it was only a very small amount of tension on there. Once you've done that, you can then go ahead and remove the bolt. Now the next step is actually going to be removing the bolt that holds this section onto the shock absorber. So located here at the bottom of the shock absorber itself, you'll see this nut and bolt that goes straight through the lower bracket and holding this back bracket on the back here that holds these pipes as well. So same as before, you're going to want to clean these threads up at the back here with a wire brush and some WD-40. Once you've done that, you're going to need your 18mm spanner and ratchet again. Now this one will actually be quite tight, so you may struggle a little bit to undo this one. Now a little tip here is actually if you put the spanner on back to front like that, it actually gives you more of a leverage in this case, so you don't hit the spanner's not hitting the body of the vehicle all the time. This part could be really tight, and actually in this one I struggle to undo it myself because of the limited space you have here, but it's done. So continue on to remove the nut and then I'll show you how to do the next section. Once you've completely slackened it off, you can remove the nut from the back of the bolt and go ahead and remove the bolt completely. Now you'll notice this bracket at the back here is actually holding one of the brake pipes in the what I presume is the ABS sensor or something on there. Just be careful not to damage those. Leave them sitting at the back there out of the way. And what you should do next is actually the bottom part of the shock absorber just here, is try and clean it up the best you can. You'll see why in just a second. Once you've cleaned it up the best you can around the bottom, you're going to need to get a screwdriver into this part here, and basically what you want to do is spread it apart. You can hear that breaking the seal there, but yeah, spread it apart best you can. It can be a bit tricky and you need to be very careful at this point not to hurt yourself or not to slip. Get something solid. In my case I'm using a 1/4 inch extension bar, and I'm going to use the end piece here, the squared off piece, to wedge into that gap once I've opened it wide enough. Now the reason for that is to hold that clamp open off the shock absorber, so we can go ahead and try and remove this bottom section. As you can see, actually may be able to see that, actually that is now separate from the shock absorber. The two parts are moving separately. Now what you want to do is go back to the bolt down below, one just here, and remove it. Should just pull out nice and easy on that. There you go, bolt's out. And that should leave you this lower arm free from the rest of the shock absorber then. Now at this point it matters a lot where your spring broke. Like in my case it broke right on the bottom, so the spring isn't actually doing anything anymore. It's applying no pressure to the shock absorber because it's not sitting on the seat anymore. But if your spring is still sitting on the seat applying pressure to the shock absorber, you may need a set of spring compressors at this point to compress the spring up so you can actually lift the shock absorber up and out of this frame. But even in my case where the spring has completely broken applying no pressure, it's still quite tricky. You need to try and lift the shock absorber up somehow from the seat here. You're probably best off using a bar of some kind. Now there you go, that is now free from the shock absorber, but as you've seen there, it was quite tricky to lift that shock absorber up and out of the way. But like I said, if you have spring compressors, you should compress the spring as far as you can upwards at that point. That's that bracket out now, as you can see there. So now you can remove the bar or whatever you use to lift it up with, and you can remove the 4 bolts at the top here from the top section, which I'll show you next. Now at the top here you'll notice that there's 4 nuts, so 13mm, so you're going to need to remove them first of all. Now what I do is actually slacken them off first, and then I use an impact driver or a drill of some kind to remove them all the way off, because as you can see there's quite a bit of thread sticking out the top there. They shouldn't be too tight because they're only small nuts. Once you've undone them 4 bolts at the top there, the shock absorber, you should be able to go ahead and remove it from where the caliper is, to this side of it. This is where it should come out of. And now we can head to the workshop and actually replace the spring on the shock absorber. So this part is actually quite a tricky part, to be honest. You're going to need a 6mm Allen key, something similar to this with a long reach on it, and an 18mm socket. Now the 18mm socket needs to go on first over the nut at the top there, and then you need to reach through, because if you see on the top there you've actually got an Allen head inside there. So you put the nut on and then the Allen bolt. And what you want to do is actually have the ratchet, if you're using a ratchet that is, as if you're doing it up on that side. On the socket, I mean in this case I'm only using a pair of grips. I do have the correct tool to do this, but I'm not going to go searching for that at the moment. I could spend another hour looking for that. So in this case I'm just going to be using a pair of grips onto the 18mm socket. As you can see there, that now rests on the worktop there. So if I can get a good grip on that and pull down, that should there you go, that's that gone. You feel it go. Once it goes, it should be quite loose. There you go. That's nice and easy now, that is. So Undo that all the way whilst the ratchet's rested on the workbench, because obviously that supports itself on the bench there, so you don't have to worry about holding two things at once. Makes it a lot easier. There we go, that's almost on. Should be able to do that by hand now for the last bit. There you go, and you can remove the ratchet, and there you go, there's the nut. And now you'll be able to remove the whole top section of the shock absorber. All that should come off as one piece like that. Put that to one side, and then you can remove the broken spring. You can see what's happened to it here. And there you go. You can actually see there's quite a bit of corrosion on there actually at that point. And you can see it's just started to eat into the spring just there. On both sections. I mean, that actually happened on both springs, driver's side and the passenger side, in exactly the same place. And if I get the other spring quick, you can see that that is exactly the same thing with the corrosion started to eat into the spring. And they literally happened 5 days apart from each other while the car was sitting on the driveway. I mean, look at that. They are literally mirror image of each other. Anyway, let's carry on putting the new spring on. So we'll take the new spring, we can then slide it over the shock absorber. Now, actually before I do that, I'll show you. You notice at the bottom here, there's actually a seat. Just here, you got that on the bottom part and the top part where the spring sits. And that's basically where the end of the spring sits in, which I'll show you now. So you put the spring over, you can see there, spring sits nice and snug into that little seat at the bottom there. Now for this part, you don't actually need any spring compressors for the way these set up. You're going to need them for later on putting the shock absorber back onto the vehicle. So once you put the spring on there, you take your whole assembly, which we took off a moment ago, put that back on. Just be a little bit careful to line it up with the hole in the top. There you go, that is through now. And it gives you, you can see that, just enough clearance in the top there to actually get the nut back on. Basically, we're going to do the opposite to what we just done a moment ago. Put your ratchet on as if you're undoing something, put it into the Allen bolt, and obviously you're going to sit it the opposite way this time, and then do exactly the same as we've done a moment ago. You may notice a bit of resistance this time, as you're doing the nut up, you're compressing the spring. And remember, actually, as I was saying, to make sure that you put the spring into the seat, like I was showing on the bottom there, there's exactly the same on the top part. Just make sure the spring is seated correctly, that's all. Now once you feel it go tight, obviously now need to get a good grip on it, give it a really good tweak on there to make sure it's nicely nipped up. Yep, I'll say that's nice and tight. So quickly, before we go outside and fit it back to the vehicle again, on the bottom section here, you're going to want to give it a bit of a clean up where the clamp used to sit, because obviously you don't want to put the clamp back on and you're going to get all this crud and all this mess between the clamp and the shock absorber. So give this section a bit of a clean up, just to make it a little bit easier to fit the bracket back on as well. So once you've done that, we're ready to move back outside and fit the shock absorber back to the vehicle. Now this is the part where you're going to need the spring compressors to fit this back on, or else you're never going to get it back into position. Okay, so this part is where we want to fit the shock absorber back to the vehicle, which can be quite tricky. The spacings for each of where the bolts go are actually different, so it'll only go on one way. If you look at the evidence at the top, you can normally see the pattern of which position it was in. I mean, you may have to try various different ways, but it will go in. So if you lift it back up through the gap that it came out of, now like I said, this is a very tricky part. You have to line the holes up, there you go, like that, and then you've got to take one of them 13mm nuts, reach over the top and screw it on, just to hold it into position so you can get the other 3 nuts on. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and put the rest of the nuts on, but you may have to manoeuvre it around a little bit, because you can see these rear ones here are actually very close to the body work, so they're actually quite difficult to get on because they've got a little bit of a washer lip on them. So you might have to wiggle it around a little bit just to get them started, that's all. Once you've got all 4 nuts on, you can then go ahead and do them up, just trying to line the little bolts up to the witness marks. I always like to do that so you know it's in exactly the same position as it came off then, because you can see There's quite a bit of movement there. Once they're all back on and relatively tight, just give them a nip up. Don't over tighten them though, they're only a 13mm bolt. They just need to be nipped up nicely, that's all. Okay, this is the point where we're going to need our set of spring compressors, which you can get from most automotive outlets like Halfords or Eurocar parts. We're going to need to fit them to the spring and the shock absorber to compress it as far as we can so we can get this bracket back into position. Now this can be quite a tight fit to get these in here, but first one we will go on this side. Now this side I would actually like to point out, because of the positioning of it, the bottom part of the spring compressor I would personally hook underneath the seat here, because you've got a small lip under there which you can actually hook underneath. Make sure it's all the way on obviously when you start to do it up. Don't do it up just yet, get that nipped up on there like that, and then we can put the second spring compressor on the other side. Now for these particular spring compressors, you're going to need a 21mm socket to do them up. Now to start with, I would personally do up the rear one that's actually hooked onto the spring itself. Take as much compression off with that one first of all, because obviously we don't want to put too much pressure onto this front one because it's not actually hooked on the spring, it's underneath the seat. The only purpose of this one really is to pull up the shock absorber with the spring as well, so we can get the bracket back on the bottom there. You can move to this side on the compressor that's underneath the seat here, just to gently lift the whole shock absorber up. Now this is all awkward as well, so you need to be very careful here. Try and hold that under the seat there while you're doing it up nice and slowly. Make sure everything stays nice and level while you're doing it. As you're doing this, you will notice the spring at the top starts to fall out of its seating. Now just be careful of that a little bit later on when you take the spring compressors off, that it's seated correctly, top and the bottom. You need to try and lift the spring and the shock absorber up together to make sure it's seated in the top there, so the shock absorber is sitting at as high a position as possible. Then you take your, if you see here, the bracket, hook that over the arm down the bottom here, not into the bolt hole yet, just hook it over the arm at the front here to give you a bit of extra clearance, and then this is where the very tricky part starts. You have to push down on the disc to make sure the whole hub moves down while lifting the shock absorber up, and it's going to be a very tight fit, as it is on this one, to try and push this bracket underneath that shock absorber to align it back into the hole again. And it's a very, very tricky part, this is, and you do need a lot of strength as well. So push down on this section, as you can see, look, that's straight underneath there, and you just got to line that up, and there you go, in. Now on this arm here there's actually a seat at the back here where the shock absorber sits, so you can't push it through too far. You just got to make sure it's seated correctly into that. Now that's through, we can start undoing the spring compressors now, but being very careful as we do so to make sure, I'll show you a bit closer actually, to make sure at the top here that the spring is seated into that, and also you can see here there's a cutout and a nod piece there where that sits in basically. Obviously you can see here it's twisted, so when I'm undoing these spring compressors I've got to make sure I rotate that back into its correct position while the spring is still seated correctly there and seated correctly at the bottom. It's not too bad at the bottom there, there's a very small gap, but I'll try and shuffle that round as I undo the compressors. So start by doing this one first, the one that's seated underneath the seat of the shock absorber. As the spring starts to expand, just keep checking that the spring is correctly seated at the top and the bottom and nothing's moving badly out of position. At the moment that seems to be lining itself up pretty well. Go ahead and remove that one, I think. Once you've removed the first spring compressor, you can then move on to the second one, which again, making sure that it's all seated correctly and where it should be. This one needs a bit of a swivel just there like that. The base of that one just needs a small swivel. There we go. Once everything looks like it's lined up, you can then start undoing the second spring compressor. And this is where you've got to be very careful that everything all lines up and this drops down to seat into the bottom bracket correctly. Now here, the best part, because obviously everything wants to move, try and hold onto the spring while you're undoing the compressor. So once you've undone the second spring compressor, you can go ahead and remove that, double checking that everything's seated correctly. I mean, you may find at this point, actually, you may still have some small amount of movement. You can rotate it to make sure the spring's seated correctly, top and bottom. At this point, you may notice that this rubber has dropped down like it has here. And all that does is basically it pushes up into here. So you just basically push that up. I mean, you can probably use a screwdriver just under this section here, just to pop that back in there, that's all. just like so. All that is to protect the shock absorber inside there from getting any dirt and grit into it. At this point, we can go ahead and line up the lower bracket section of the shock absorber here, sliding it up the shock absorber and trying to line that up best we can just there. Again, you may need to push down on the whole hub to line that up. There we have it. Get the nut back on there and we do that back up. At this point, we're going to want to take a second jack and place it just underneath the lower arm, this section just here, and we're going to want to lift that up just a little bit for now, just to confirm that this bracket is firmly seated correctly on that little lip just under that I was saying about earlier on. And then we can go ahead and remove this and fit the nut and bolt back in. So you get a screwdriver on there again, get a bit of a lever, so just drop straight out, there we go, and that's clamped nicely back on there. It might be worth pointing out as well, just to clean the thread up on this bolt before we put it back in. So now we can go ahead and stick that back in there, all the way through. Remember to get this bracket that holds the pipe work on there as well. This bracket actually seats itself. It's got two little lips that stick out here. Will actually help seat it correctly on the back there. So you can actually go ahead and do that nut and bolt up nice and tight at this point. So once that's tightened and you've made sure that this bracket sits nicely, as you can see there, against the shock absorber nice and flush, you can then move to the other side and align the anti-roll bar to put the bolt back into that. Now as you can see here, the anti-roll bar drop link is sitting just here. It's got a bolt into this section just here. You know, obviously there's quite a big gap there, so what we want to do is jack the whole hub up to get that somewhere closer, and then we can use a metal bar just to leave it the last little bit. Actually in this case it's jacked up pretty nicely and leveled up there. Sometimes it doesn't and you need to get a metal bar probably down there on the anti-roll bar itself just to leave it that last little bit. At this point you can go ahead and tighten this bolt up as well. Now you can actually go ahead and remove the second jack from under the lower arm and then go ahead and do up the lower bolt on the arm just down here. You can nip that up nice and tight now. Okay, so at this point now you've done all the bolts back up, just go over every bolt again just to double check. So you want to just double check this bolt down here, make sure that's nice and tight, make sure the anti-roll bar drop link is nice and tight, make sure this bolt with a little bracket on for the pipes is nice and tight, and obviously your 4 bolts at the top there. Once you've double checked everything's nice and tight, you can actually go ahead and put the wheel back on the vehicle. Okay, so once the wheel's back on the car, drop it down, do the bolts up nice and tight, and then we can move on to putting the plastic trims back on under the bonnet. They literally just slot back in. You can see there's like a groove all the way along where the back edge of this just sits inside that groove. So you tuck it in all the way along. You can see there how it lines up. Once that section's on, you can then go ahead and put this trim back on, which you'll notice is actually like a lip in the middle, one that side and one this side. You just make sure that tucks underneath the lip on there. That holds the front end of that trim in place then. So there you have it, one spring fitted. Now obviously I want to do the other side as well because both sides broken, but that'll be another time. I don't need to do a video on that because it's exactly the same on both sides. But anyway, if you don't feel confident taking on a job like this, please do take it to a garage because it is quite tricky and heavy duty. Plus you need specialist tools like the spring compressors. But if this video has helped you out in some way, please don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell notification so you get notified each time I upload. Until next time guys, take care.